Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'll be joined later in the show by Milena, aka No Justice MTG. Of course, nearly all of tonight's show will be about the release of Israeli and Palestinian captives and Donald Trump being in Sharm el-Sheikh to speak to other leaders about what is next for Gaza. I'll be joined by Andreas Krieg to speak about that. I'll also speak later in the show to Milena Ansari from Human Rights Watch to discuss the language that we constantly hear, Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, and how that can be somewhat misleading. We'll end the show by discussing the Green Party having hit a milestone of 100,000 members and what that means for Corbyn, Sultana and your party. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. As ever, do let us know your comments in the YouTube chat. Earlier today, Hamas released all 20 of the last living Israeli hostages it has been holding in Gaza. And while Israel released almost 2,000 Palestinians it has held in captivity, often arbitrarily, without trial and in abhorrent conditions. The exchange is part of a ceasefire deal brokered by Donald Trump, which many hope, though some remain very skeptical, will bring an enduring end to 2 years of relentless genocidal attacks by Israel on the Gaza Strip. The Israeli captives were handed over to the Red Cross in 2 groups and have all now returned to Israel, where they were taken to undergo medical examinations. The remains of 28 dead Israelis captured by Hamas were also due to be returned today. And the Israeli Defense Forces have released footage of some of the freed hostages being reunited with their families.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
This is obviously momentous news inside Israel, where there have been widespread celebrations. These were the scenes in Tel Aviv's Hostage Square, which for 2 years has been the site of protests demanding the return of Israeli captives. Among the Palestinian captives being released today are 1,700 people who Israel took from the Gaza Strip over the past 2 years and held without charge. There are also 250 prisoners, a large number of whom have been jailed in Israel for decades. Now, the prisoners are different from the captives because they've been formally found guilty of crimes, but that's by military courts in processes widely criticised by human rights groups. Now, unlike the detainees from the first group who have started returning to their families, about 150 of the long-term prisoners will be deported and forced into exile. These were the scenes, though, as the 100 prisoners who aren't being deported arrived in the West Bank.
250 Palestinian prisoners released from jail, many of them having served life sentences. Tremendous amount of excitement and joy as they are being received. Only about 100 of them being released to the West Bank. That's these prisoners here. Their families have gathered at the Ramallah Cultural Center, which is where we are, to greet them when they see the prisoners released. That is not only welcoming back their sons and brothers, but it's part of their cause for the Palestinian people. You know, again, as we've said, the Israelis see some of these people as terrorists. You had an appeal to the Supreme Court in Israel from family members of those who'd been killed by some of these men in attacks, saying they shouldn't be released, but that was overridden. All those prisoners have been released now.
And we're going to talk in detail later in the show about how sort of saying these are the men responsible for those deaths is potentially complicated by the fact that they were tried under military courts, which don't have proper due process. Crowds also gathered earlier in Khan Yunis, Gaza, to welcome home other Palestinian captives. So those captives, as I discussed later with my guest from Human Rights Watch, were just arbitrarily picked up in Gaza over the past 2 years, 1,700 of them. Some of the freed detainees have been talking to Al Jazeera about the conditions they were subjected to in Israel, and the outlet reports that detainees were shot with rubber bullets and electrocuted by the Israeli captors who tortured them multiple times a day. Relatives of some of the returning Palestinians have said Israel has warned them not to publicly celebrate the release of their family members and threatened to rearrest them if they do. And of course, it seems Israel wants footage of its own captives being jubilantly welcomed home to dominate the narrative today. Speaking of dominating the narrative, Donald Trump arrived in Israel to address the Knesset and to declare victory for what he calls his peace plan. Here's what he had to say.
After 2 harrowing years in darkness and captivity, 20 courageous hostages are returning to the glorious embrace of their families, and it is glorious. 28 more precious loved ones are coming home at last to rest in this sacred soil for all of time. And after so many years of unceasing war and endless danger, today the skies are calm, the guns are silent, the sirens are still, and the sun rises on a holy land that is finally at peace, a land and a region that will live, God willing, in peace for all eternity.
Trump was treated to several standing ovations during the speech, but not everyone was thrilled to see him there.
I've known him for many years, and I've seen it over and over again.
להוציא את חבר הכנסת עודה, להוציא אותו מהאולם, להוציא אותו מיד, החוצה, החוצה.
Please expel this Knesset member. Please expel this Knesset member. Please expel Knesset member Kasif out of the hall. Please expel him immediately.
So the person being expelled there was Ayman Odeh, an Arab-Israeli lawmaker who was holding up a sign saying, "Recognize Palestine." So that's what gets you kicked out of the Knesset. He was apparently one of 2 lawmakers kicked out of the plenum hall for causing disruption. After his speech, Trump flew to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for a meeting with numerous world leaders, including Keir Starmer, to discuss the future of his plan for Gaza. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi greeted Trump upon his arrival at what is being billed as a peace summit. 2 parties are notably absent, though, Hamas and Israel. Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian National Authority, is in attendance, but Netanyahu is not attending, and Israel has not sent a representative in his place. Don't worry, though, as I said, our Prime Minister is there. According to Education Minister Bridget Phillips, in the UK, under his leadership, has played a key role behind the scenes in shaping the Gaza plan. Just before we came on air, Trump himself took part in a signing ceremony for the peace plan at the summit.
This took 3,000 years to get to this point. Can you believe it?
So there does seem to be a misunderstanding. Trump thinks he has solved the problem of the Middle East as opposed to having brokered a ceasefire agreement, which doesn't actually solve any of the long-term problems and beyond stopping the immediate genocide, which is, of course, very significant. As Western leaders pat themselves on the back, though, those who have opposed this genocide will balk at the idea that these men are peacemakers. Guardian columnist Nesreen Malik published this piece today. While the perpetrators of Gaza's genocide pose as its saviours, survivors return home to a wasteland. And the article goes on to say this. Today, Sharm el-Sheikh will host the most high-profile gathering of global leaders in the Middle East of recent years. Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Pedro Sanchez and others are meeting to end the war in the Gaza Strip, enhance efforts to achieve peace and stability in the Middle East and usher in a new era of regional security and stability. If the ceasefire holds, this language is an augur of the future, one where there is no reckoning, no addressing of root causes, only a hurtling into the imperatives of cleanings up and workings out. All the while, illegal occupation continues and another chapter of Israel's violations is furtively closed without accountability, not only for Israel, but for its sponsor. I'm joined now by Andreas Krieg, senior lecturer at the School of Security Studies at King's College London. Andreas, thank you so much for joining us. I want to talk a bit later about the situation on the ground in Gaza. Let's begin, though, with the diplomacy. So from what you've seen so far, does this look like a ceasefire that can last?
It is a ceasefire deal, as you rightly said. It's not a peace deal. It's a ceasefire deal that could last if the mediator's intent, which is to translate these small steps into consecutive bigger steps that can address the thorny issues, the more controversial issues that have been so far left completely out of the negotiation, and ultimately lead to justice for Palestinians' right of self-determination, and actually thereby addressing the root causes of the insurgency, if you will, that have led to Hamas building up into the organization that they are today. As it stands, it's a ceasefire that all it does is really allowing you to get the prisoners and the hostages back, which I think is great. I think it was a very, very significant and well-deserved sort of step to take to get an end to the atrocities being committed in Gaza. But, is it going to hold? It really depends on the thorny issues being negotiated, which is governance, security provision, and some sort of mechanism that allows Palestinians to govern themselves rather than this being some sort of interim solution that will become permanent, as we've seen so many times in the Middle East, in particular in Palestine, where Israel usually obstructs any final settlement and final resolution to keep everything up in limbo and that limbo is usually a sort of situation that they can manage for an indefinite period of time, and then it becomes the new status quo. So that's kind of the big concern. But let's be optimistic. Let's see how we can get to step 2 and 3.
What's happening in the peace summit in Sharm el-Sheikh? Is there actually any sort of talking, any negotiation, any diplomacy going on, or is this just sort of a moment for Donald Trump to pat himself and let's face it, everyone else? I mean, all the world leaders are saying this is brilliant. We've managed to achieve this. Keir Starmer as well. Is this just a sort of photo opportunity, or are they discussing something meaningful there?
When Donald Trump gets involved in anything, it's usually a photo op. Shaping the narrative. His entire messaging around this is completely off and completely removed from the reality on the ground. Obviously, as you said earlier, he seems to suggest or seems to believe that he's solved what he says 3,000 years worth of conflict, when all he's done is obviously broker a ceasefire. And obviously, even there, he was significant. But let's face it, essentially the mediators were key here, and the mediators were Qatar, Egypt, and the Arab countries. And they used Trump to pressure Netanyahu, which is essentially what he did. And in that way, he's done more than Biden, let's put it that way. But that's about the end of that. So I think for the most part, this is a photo op. But what is important is the convening power. The fact that everyone is coming together, everyone is seemingly underwriting the process. Everyone wants this to stop. There is a consensus in the international community that this war must not return to these sort of atrocities that we've seen over the last 2 years. And in that respect, I think this is significant. But the problem is, obviously, Europeans are not playing any role, despite the fact that they're there. Macron has done a little bit better than the UK, than Starmer did. But essentially, Europe is on the sidelines, on the periphery. They haven't played a role in any of this. But they're obviously trying to take some credit. But nonetheless, we do need the Europeans, and we do need the international community to underwrite the process, to convene people, to put pressure, and to make sure that Israel doesn't fall back into the old pattern of using violence to solve political issues. But beyond that, nothing will be negotiated in Sharm el-Sheikh now. But once everyone has confirmed that this is what they want, I think mediators can then go back to the next step to really address the more pressing issues, where I think we'll probably hit some brick walls because I don't see the Venn diagram that's been created by Qatar, Egypt, and the Arab negotiators as being as far-reaching as security arrangements about disarmament as well as governance, where the Israelis want one thing and Hamas wants something completely the opposite. So I think that's when it will really be tested, whether this is more than just a temporary ceasefire.
Earlier today, for a sort of brief time, it was being reported that Netanyahu was going to go to this meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. That then got reversed, that got cancelled. What's the significance of that? Do you sort of have a read on what that was about?
I think it wasn't let's put it that way. Netanyahu has a long track record of 30-odd years of being a politician first and not really a statesman ever. So he never has the national interest of Israel in mind when he does what he does. He does it to safeguard his own political skin. And I think what he did today, he did that in response to pressure from his coalition partners. So it's really about pleasing the home constituency rather than doing what might be the right thing to do. On the other hand, there's been some pressure as well from opposition from some Arab countries and allegedly even from Turkey, who are saying they don't want Netanyahu to, take some of the limelight of what's been going on because he was the single most obstructive and destructive human being of the last 2 years, obstructing every single opportunity to come to a mediated settlement or negotiated settlement. So he really doesn't deserve to be there. But it also means that Netanyahu has been somewhat sidelined. It also shows that Israel has been sidelined. Obviously, they still have to play a role in this, but it's not like the international community is crediting Israel for having done anything. And so I think, while some people are concerned that Israel might just fall back into old patterns of behavior and everything we'll, let bygones be bygones and all of this is now water under the bridge. I think this is not the case. It also suggests that the international community still will, there's a lot that Israel has to answer for, and I don't think they're going back to business as usual just yet, which is important. So I think good that Netanyahu didn't come in the end, and good that he had to listen to his domestic audience.
So we're going to go through some sort of developments in the situation on the ground. So bear with me and Andreas, because of course, thankfully, since the ceasefire was announced last week, the bombs have stopped falling and IDF soldiers have withdrawn from the more heavily populated areas of Gaza. Israel is also finally allowing in more aid after deliberately subjecting the entire population of the Strip to starvation and denying them medical supplies. Under the ceasefire deal, Israel is supposed to allow around 600 trucks to enter Gaza every day, though it seems that number has not yet been reached today. And meanwhile, UNRWA, that's the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, appears to still be banned from Gaza despite the ceasefire deal. And the agency posted on X earlier today asking to be let back in. So they said only UNRWA can deliver life-saving aid at the scale Gaza needs. We have the network, the experience, and the trust of the community. The state of Israel must let UNRWA bring in the huge amount of aid that has been blocked in our warehouses in Jordan and Egypt since the 2nd of March. Let UNRWA do its work. Even beyond the question, though, of whether or not enough aid will get through, the situation in Gaza remains dangerous. Fighting has broken out between Hamas forces and other armed factions, some of them reportedly backed by Israel. Palestinian journalist Salah al-Jafarawi was killed during clashes in the neighborhood of Sabra on Sunday. And Palestinian sources told Al Jazeera the 28-year-old was shot dead by members of an Israeli-linked militia fighting Hamas in the Sabra neighborhood. Israeli media has previously reported that Benjamin Netanyahu's government is arming militias inside Gaza, which is something that Gazan political analyst Mohammed Shahada thinks will lead to more violence in the Strip. Earlier today, he posted this on X. There's no civil war in Gaza whatsoever. There's only an Israeli attempt to stage a civil war through proxy gangs, criminals and collaborators. Israel is sheltering most of those groups, e.g. Abu Shabab, Al-Astral, Al-Mansi, beyond the yellow line, and will keep using them for chaos. So the yellow line is what separates the part of Gaza currently being occupied by Israeli troops and the part which isn't. And of course, whoever manages to take charge in Gaza, its people will face the enormous challenge of reconstructing an area which has been flattened by 2 years of intense bombing. What's more, according to Dropsite News, the destruction to Palestinian infrastructure continued after the ceasefire was announced. So the outlet has been tracking arson attacks by IDF troops on civilian homes and infrastructure, including a sanitation plant in Gaza City. The Dropsite News report says this: the scope of the arson perpetrated in Gaza City just after the ceasefire was agreed, but before Israel's cabinet approved it, was broader than at any other time Dropsite has tracked during the assault on the Strip. Its perpetrators were not confined to a single unit, nor was the burning confined to a specific neighborhood. So people, these Israeli soldiers thinking, oh, we're going to have to leave soon, let's burn some stuff down. Palestinians in Gaza will also likely have to deal with hazards such as unexploded ordnance. A video here has emerged today showing the aftermath of what authorities in Gaza say was the explosion of a suspicious object. So it's unclear what caused that blast, which reportedly injured 3 children, but we can assume there will be an enormous amount of unexploded bombs lying under the rubble in Gaza. Andreas, I want your thoughts on this. And I suppose to begin, now we're in this ceasefire, is the biggest threat to Palestinians in Gaza the breakdown of social order?
Absolutely. I think, and this has obviously been years in the making, what the Israelis have tried to achieve is a complete destruction of anything that resembles a socio-political order or a civil societal order. They've destroyed civil society. They've destroyed any sort of critical national infrastructure, from hospitals to electricity, water supplies, roads, to governance infrastructure, making it impossible to, even on the local level, to govern the territory. And what they've also done on top of that, and I think we're seeing some of this now, is developing their own sort of networks of non-state actors that they are utilizing to create more chaos. And some of that infighting between Hamas and some of the clans that have been aligned with Israel and paid and armed by Israel, we've seen that unfolding over the last couple of days already. So there's a big concern that this might disintegrate. The security vacuum that Israel leaves behind might disintegrate into some sort of civil war-like clashes, which would be in Israel's interest after all, because usually Israel does that in order to then create a pretext to say we have to go back in to create law and order. It's a little bit like what they've done in southern Syria as well, where they are using the pretext of the plight of a minority within the minority of the Druze community in Syria to not remove themselves from occupied territory in southern Syria that they took over the last year. And so they might do the same in Gaza. So if there was a chaos, if the vacuum that exists on the ground persists for an indefinite period of time, and obviously Hamas being a network in itself that is very decentralized, you have smaller cells that remain in different parts of the territory, but they're unable to govern, they're unable to provide security. If that persists, I think we might get into sort of territories where the Israelis might argue they can't possibly withdraw from the Gaza Strip, which is ultimately what Netanyahu wants. He wants to maintain a presence. And so it's very, very important for the transitional authority set up or to be set up by the Americans to really build up a force quite quickly to help with law enforcement. For the time being, the understanding has been that Trump allows Hamas to operate on the ground to maintain law and order in certain areas. But obviously, the longer this kind of interim arrangement lasts, the more we will probably see internal violence. And so that's a massive threat to what will hopefully be a transition to Palestinian governance, which Israel will try and the IDF will try to undermine where they can.
What stops that societal breakdown? Presumably, it can only be Hamas for now, because I mean they've been governing Gaza for a long time, for decades now. There presumably isn't another force that can just immediately come in, or unless that's the Palestinian Authority. I mean, because I mean we've seen in many of these. It's too early to call this a post-war situation, isn't it? But sort of after the most heightened phase of war comes to a close, it is that state breakdown that can often be just as deadly. So, what would be what's the best case here?
Obviously, yeah, you're right. I mean, usually the immediate post-war environment is usually one where, there's time of reckoning, people are trying to settle scores, and I think we're seeing some of that happening now. But like I said, Hamas is not in the state to maintain law and order across the Strip. So, they have been decimated. The leaders have been. So what makes up the organization, the hierarchy has been completely degraded. And so you're left with certain cells that have been, again, the sort of experienced fighters have been killed. And you're left with these newbies who've been recruited over the last 2 years, who are not very well trained, who don't have a lot of discipline. And so they're certainly an insufficient force to maintain law and order. And then usually when you have these sort of post-war environment where you transition from high-intensity warfare to peace enforcement or stabilization, you have a stabilization force on the ground. So going back to Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously, once the old regime collapsed, the military moved in and created a transitional authority. We had that in Germany after the Second World War. Everything disintegrates. But then you have obviously had an allied command that would take over law enforcement as they cleanse the area of the enemy. The issue here is now that you have a vacuum because, effectively, like I said, Hamas is in a position to govern. You have different non-state actors and clan structures that have effectively governed the territory during the war as Hamas was going underground. And they themselves might not want to surrender authority. And hence why I say it is so important that this new transitional authority will be set up very quickly with an interim international security mechanism that can actually maintain law and order, as well as train as quickly as possible a new Palestinian force, police force that can create and maintain stability on the ground.
Andreas, Krieg, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Milena in a moment for her thoughts on the day's developments. First, let's take a look at a clip of Donald Trump on Air Force One this weekend, and where he made some interesting comments himself about Hamas.
Hamas rearming, instituting themselves as a Palestinian police force, shooting rivals. What is your message to Hamas?
We are standing because they do want to stop the problems, and they've been open about it, and we gave them approval for a period of time. You have to understand, they've lost probably 60,000 people. That's a lot of retribution. They've lost 60,000 people. And the ones that are living right now were, in many cases, very young when this all started. And we are having them watch that there's not going to be big crime or some of the problems that you have when you have areas like this that have been literally demolished.
You have 2 million people, and probably it'll be less than that, but you have close to 2 million people going back to buildings that have been demolished. And a lot of bad things can happen. So we want it to be safe. I think it's going to be fine. Who knows for sure, Katie? But I think it's going to be fine.
Not necessarily reassured by him saying he thinks it's going to be fine. But I mean, there were lots of interesting things in that answer. So he's saying Hamas has actual approval. He's sort of explicitly saying they have approval to reassert order, very much in contrast to, say, George W. Bush after the war in Iraq. He immediately stood down all the Ba'athist forces after the fall of Saddam Hussein, leading to complete chaos, obviously looting, societal breakdown. Some of the numbers he used there, also interesting, I thought. So we said they've lost 60,000 people. Now, did he mean that was his estimate of Hamas members who'd been killed? Was it all adult men? Often adult men and Hamas are interchangeable when it comes to Western reporting of this kind of thing. The other figure I thought was interesting is when he uses the figure of less than 2 million people to talk about Gazans, which could suggest an overall death toll much higher than the official one, right? The population of Gaza before the start of Israel's war was 2.23 million. So if you're saying less than 2 million, that suggests 230,000 people killed. So is that a sort of internal assumption being made by American intelligence? Who knows? Helena, welcome to the show. Important news day. What are your thoughts on the day's events, or if you want to comment on what Donald Trump there was saying on Air Force One?
I mean, with the comments that are coming from Trump there, I mean, whilst I think that it's certainly interesting to hear those kind of numbers being said. I think the 60,000, I think in my mind, he was referring to what's the official death toll when he said they've lost that many people, not Hamas, but Hamas being the representation of Palestinians in the area, and there's been 60,000 Palestinian deaths. That's the only real number from 60,000 that makes sense to me, because that's the official reported death toll before we find out, the many of others, the scores of people who will have been buried under the rubble, who have up to this point not been identified because, of course, they haven't. Gaza has been under military control, Israeli military control, and is mostly still. We've got to remember, half of Gaza is all still going to be under Israeli military control under phase one of the drawback of IDF troops. Right? Again, this is a staged process. Or any amount of releasing of captives, that's going to be it's all part of a staged process as well, which is going to get us towards where we get to some position, at least somewhat similar to what the status quo was before October the 7th, minus, of course, all of the civilian infrastructure in Gaza. But in terms of territorial control, you'll have the Gaza Strip mostly still being containing of Palestinians, and the IDF will be patrolling the outskirts, or at least there will be some kind of DMZ at some point between where Palestinians are allowed to go and where the IDF are patrolling the border, and there'll be some kind of interim government involved at that time, right? So we're still in a very, as was pointed out by Andreas' excellent, very cogent answers there given before, of a very fragile withdrawal system, a very fragile system of governance in Gaza, a very fragile population, and this is nowhere near the end of what's happening. And given that point, it's slightly tangential to the day's events, but I think it's broadly something that is intertwined with the procedure that we're seeing of the ceasefire agreement moving along its trajectory towards the actual full achievement of an end to the conflict, which hasn't ended like that. It only ends when there's an actual peace agreement rather than a ceasefire, and that's gone through to its conclusion. Is that a lot of people who I've seen, especially on the pro-Israeli side in the UK, have been looking at what we have seen over the past few days since the announcement that the deal had been reached. And a lot of them have come out with this claim that, well, this is the end of everything, right? Why are none of the people who were protesting for a ceasefire, why are they not happy? Why are they not celebrating with joy at this point? Like, why is it only the pro-Israel types who are talking about this as a momentous achievement? I'm like, well, first of all, most of us are realists. We understand that we had a ceasefire agreement in February, and that was broken by Israel once they had got their captives back. They are the ones who hold essentially all of the cards. We know full well that the changing position of what we have seen in terms of the position of Israel isn't anything to do with internal Israeli politics. The war would be continuing if that was the case, because Netanyahu has been using the whole conflict, has been using the war, and has been using the occupation more broadly to maintain his grip on power and to be able to ensure that he doesn't have to answer to the courts in terms of his own corruption cases. Interesting, you see Trump reach out to Herzog asking him for a pardon for Netanyahu, because, of course, Netanyahu has done Trump a favor here. we're in this position because Trump is the strong man who holds all the cards, just like Biden could have been and didn't do because he was hostage to the interests of Netanyahu during the entirety of the first half of the war. And so Netanyahu and Trump have to give and take. Trump is a transactional man. He's doing this for his own personal plaudits, for his own internal politicking, not because he cares about Palestinians. But that current situation could change at any point. If Trump changes his mind, Netanyahu changes his mind. If Trump doesn't get his way, he could rip this all up immediately, and Netanyahu would go back into Gaza straight away. Again, essentially, now that he's been able to placate his own internal audience in Israel, who only wanted one thing, which was the return of the hostages. That was the main key issue that kind of united a lot of Israeli society, was wanting to have the hostages home from Gaza. Did they care about the Palestinians? No. In fact, when you look at plurality polling that Haaretz talked about, when you look at the Israeli society, when you ask them what their actual proposed solution for the conflict is, the plurality of them say that they want ethnic cleansing of all Palestinians from Judea and Samaria and Israeli sovereignty over that territory, right? That is the fundamental viewpoint here. And the one that was a sticking point in terms of how Netanyahu was prosecuting the conflict was, are the hostages home or not? Now that they are home, if Trump gave Netanyahu clearance to do it, you better believe that Netanyahu would do it. But it is Trump's own personal transactional interest in ensuring that he is seen as the president of peace, quote unquote, and indeed to placate the fraying support for Israel amongst especially the younger male audience that the MAGA voting base represents, the kind of people who were in the Nelk Boys podcast audience calling Netanyahu a war criminal, that are part of the Trump voting group but do not like Israel. He needs to placate them to keep them on side. And so that's why we're in this position right now. It's his own personal interests. And that could change. That could change. We here know, on the left side of politics and the pro-Palestinian side of politics, that even if you're just looking at the microcosm of what's happened between October the 7th and now, this could all end on the click of a finger. And so we're not going to celebrate. We won't celebrate until we actually reach the position where we've seen the entire clear out of the IDF from Gaza. And even then, that would only be a momentary celebration of the cessation of the current round of hostilities. Does this achieve justice for Palestinians? No. Does this end the occupation? No. Is that changing anything of what's happening with the E1 settlement plan over on the West Bank? Of course it doesn't. Like, none of the actual problems that the pro-Palestinian side have been protesting for decades and decades are going to be solved by this one agreement, which is what the liberals in this country, the pro-Israel, pro-Zionist liberals in this country, seem to think it does. In fact, it just shows their fundamental misunderstanding of this entire issue and our perspective on this issue, that they think that this is the achievement here, because fundamentally, as far as I can see, is because it's the West that have essentially facilitated this up until this point, which again, they could have done before now. Well, the hostages are free. That's all we've heard about this conflict. We don't actually care because fundamentally, we don't really disagree with Israel's occupation of Gaza and occupation of the West Bank, which is what we here on the left, on the pro-Palestinian cause, have been wanting to see the whole time. Whilst we will be relieved mostly, right? Fundamentally, our position here has been to the genocide, which has happened. We're never going to be able to ungenocide all the Palestinians that have been killed, right? The ceasefire agreement may be at least momentary pausing, hopefully a long-term pause in terms of the genocide of the Palestinians that has been prosecuted for the last 2 years. But fundamentally, that is only relief. We can't celebrate a return to what was previously normal in terms of Palestinians being treated like second-class citizens in their own lands, in their own homes, corralled into bantustans in the West Bank, and returning to a completely obliterated homeland in Gaza that is completely unrecognizable because there's no civilian infrastructure left. We would never celebrate that. We would never celebrate that. And so the fundamental thing that we have to understand is this is a first part of a long process of justice for the Palestinians. And until we actually see them with true justice in the long term, then and only then can we celebrate.
It's interesting, sort of, obviously that Donald Trump is definitely not going to bring justice for the Palestinians. But in terms of what happens next, does Netanyahu get to just start the genocidal war again, or do we see something else? It's interesting to me how in all of Donald Trump's speeches today, so I watched a bit of the one in Sharm el-Sheikh before we went live, and then sort of to the Knesset in the Israeli parliament, he just can't stop talking about how rich and powerful the Arab leaders are. And I do think there is, something about the psychology of Trump. Obviously, Qatar bought him this plane, this very expensive plane, and there does seem to be something whereby he's potentially not as ideologically aligned to. Obviously, he is a massive Zionist in the sense that he's much more willing than someone like Biden to explicitly say, "Oh, Netanyahu should have it all. They should have it from the river." He doesn't have those the niceties that sort of more mainstream politicians in America have had. For example, not moving the capital of Israel or not recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He breaks all those taboos, doesn't have any interest in those niceties. But at the same time, he doesn't seem to have the same sort of liberal attachment to Zionism as some of those more establishment leaders do, Democrat or Republican, because he just really likes shiny things. So sort of like now the Qataris and the Saudis, he's like, oh, actually, I really like those powerful guys. So he doesn't seem to be treating this very ideologically. He's trying to keep the most powerful guys he's on good terms with on side, which makes it somewhat more unpredictable than with other leaders in Washington, which comes with, upsides and downsides, sort of to use a massive understatement. Israeli hostages exchanged for Palestinian prisoners. That was the headline atop the New York Times website today, and there were similar headlines throughout the Western press, of course. Now, this is a good news story. The Israelis captured on October the 7th have been through an appalling ordeal, as have the more than 1,000 Palestinians released from Israeli detention as part of Trump's ceasefire deal. But there's also something deeply misleading about that phraseology, which we've heard for 2 years now. Israeli hostages, Palestinian prisoners. It implies Israelis are innocent victims, which is why they often are seen to deserve individual profiles, like this BBC article today showing each of the faces of the 20 people released from Hamas captivity. Meanwhile, Palestinian prisoners are suspect and remain largely anonymous. Because what do we think of when we hear the word prisoners? We think of criminals, of people who have been arrested for wrongdoing and who have been subjected to fair trials, who have been convicted. A prisoner being held, unlike a hostage being taken, doesn't immediately imply an injustice. So what does this story, or this way of telling this story, miss? Well, earlier today, I spoke to Milena Ansari from Human Rights Watch, who was speaking to me from Jerusalem.
This is a really important question because when we talk about the Palestinians that are being released from Israeli custody and detention, it's a whole variety of unlawful detention, meaning the total number of Palestinian prisoners and detainees currently is 11,000 plus. Amongst them, half of whom do not have any charges presented against them and they've never been to trial. So this goes to unlawful detention, a form of administrative detention, which is basically detaining a person without charge or trial, and it can be renewed indefinitely based on secret information. So neither the detainee nor their lawyers are aware of what the charges, if there are any charges against the Palestinian held in Israeli detention. So administrative detainees are held on the presumption that they might in the future commit some kind of offense. And the way the Israeli authorities use this is that they hold children under administrative detention. So Defense for Children International Palestine reported records high of children held unlawfully. When children should be held as a last resort, we see Israel detaining them without charges. This is similar to human rights defenders, political activists, and amongst many other. So the main point also, even those with a conviction or with a sentence, most of the time or all of them, the majority, have been tried and prosecuted before an Israeli military court. That lacks any fair trial guarantees. So, for the basic fair trial guarantee that is innocent until proven guilty, that doesn't exist in Israeli military courts. But the contrary, every Palestinian is guilty, whether they like it or not, or whether they committed a crime or not. To give you an understanding, the conviction rate in Israeli military courts is 99.7%. So almost always it ends up with a conviction. And the sentences are high because Israeli military orders place extremely high and exaggerated sentences. So for someone throwing a stone, they can get up to 10 years imprisonment. And if that stone hits a moving vehicle, they can get up to 20 years. So basically, the system is built in order to keep Palestinians inside prison. And the last point I'll make here is this is basically part of, the result of a separate criminal justice system. This is 100% part and parcel of Israel's apartheid and persecution that's implemented against Palestinians.
We'll talk in detail about the people released today and the people who weren't. I suppose just to get some clarity on the hostages, prisoners distinction. So I suppose to be a hostage, it's about intent, isn't it? You've captured these people to get something in exchange for returning them, some kind of ransom, essentially. Prisoners. So I suppose on the Palestinian side, what the Israelis have done is not explicit that they've taken these people for ransom, but the way that prisoner can be misleading is because prisoner suggests in the mind of the audience that these people have been proven by some fair process to have committed a crime, whereas in fact, these people are in many cases arbitrarily detained, even if it's not explicitly to achieve some kind of ransom, as is the case when it comes to Hamas with the Israeli detainees, with the Israeli captives.
That's exactly it. In a way, to simplify it a bit more, sorry for all the legal stuff that I mentioned, but that's context and reality of Palestinians in Israeli custody. To simplify it, both hostage taking and unlawful detention is a form of unlawful deprivation of liberty. They both fall under the main element that a person is held unlawfully and they shouldn't be in detention or deprived of their liberty in general. The difference is the intent. Hamas clearly said they're taking on these people, depriving them of their liberty in order to put pressure on Israel. And, context is important. Israel many times doesn't need a reason to hold Palestinians. So in a way, they don't feel the need to say we're holding them for a prison exchange to, balance the scale in a way. And this is part of the dehumanization of Palestinians. When Palestinians are always looked at, if they're in prison, for sure they did something. They're convicted of a crime. They did something major. But the reality is, and this is what the media sometimes and many times neglects to prove and clarify, is that that's not necessarily the case. These Palestinians in detention are not dangerous criminals. There are people who the Israeli occupation forces have arrested and detained in order either to silence them, either to put pressure on them. So the thing is, it's part of the dehumanization of Palestinians who are killed in Gaza. We have to say they are civilians, but when everything happens otherwhere, we just say people in general. And for example, another example, if we say like a child in detention, if they're around 17 or 18, we'd say a teenager, but they're still children. Unfortunately, we've been seeing a lot of this dehumanization language go about in the past 2 years.
And let's talk, I suppose, more precisely about the people who have been released from Israeli jails over the past few hours. So as far as I understand it, there's 250 people who are classified as Palestinian prisoners, and they are people who have been charged and found guilty of a crime, although, as you say, this is in military courts, there isn't really any due process. And the other group of people is 1,700 detainees from Gaza, and they were essentially picked up, weren't they, sort of during the war, somewhat arbitrarily, including 15 minors. So yeah, I mean, if you could give us a few more details about those two groups of people, and if there are any sort of important differences between them.
Yeah, I'll start off with the around 1,700 plus Palestinians who were arrested and rounded up from Gaza by Israeli ground forces the past 2 years. And for this, let me be extremely clear, for these 1,700 plus, all of them are held arbitrary and were detained arbitrary, because none of these 1,700 were ever presented with a list of charges or were ever put before a judge or a military trial. They were held under something that the Israeli authorities call the unlawful combatants law. And it's a similar method of administrative detention, detaining someone under the presumption that they may in the future do something. All these 1,700 should not have been in Israeli detention. They should not have been arrested. We've been, for Human Rights Watch, we documented, for example, the arrest and detention of healthcare workers from Gaza who were rounded up, for example, during their medical evacuation from the north to the south. And these medical evacuations were coordinated by the Israeli forces on the ground. And yet paramedics, doctors, nurses, when they were at a checkpoint, they were detained by Israeli forces and after months or weeks or days released. Again, no charges, no trial. The only reason these individuals were detained, for example, is to either get information from them. Most of the time, they did not have any information about anything of the hostilities because they're healthcare workers. But they also were detained as a form of pressure, adding more numbers to how many Palestinians are in detention. So from those who were sent back to Gaza or released to Gaza, it included 2 women. So 2 women who were also detained from Gaza and illegally moved and transferred within Israel, which is the occupying power. And it included a child as well. So this just gives you a sense of who they are. And again, emphasis, they should not have been in detention to begin with. The other bunch or the other group of released Palestinians were, as you mentioned, yes, those who had high sentences, those who had convictions against them while they were prosecuted in a military court. But I'll give you an example of a few, not to name names, but some of the high sentences are like 2 decades, 20 years plus. And these were individuals who were arrested and detained during the Second Intifada in 2000. So these were people or individuals who were either, taking part in protests or any operations during the Second Intifada. And this was during, when the population was rising against occupation. So this all goes into, the system of oppression and domination, regardless of how a Palestinian wants to fight for a liberated Palestine. There's always, these military courts and military orders that make it almost impossible for anyone to be seen as the arbitrary detention that they have. An example of this, I'll be more clear. Mohammed al-Halabi, for example, he was released in the previous prison exchange deal, and he is the director of New Vision, an organization that was based in Gaza. And the charge against him was, funding money to Hamas, and there were no direct, connections or direct proof to that. So his detention was in order to silence New Vision's work. And then later he was released during a prisoner exchange. These are just some of the groups that were released. And, from the ones, the 250, with high sentences, 154 will be exiled, and they will be released to Gaza, and from Gaza to Egypt. And then we don't even know. I've been trying to figure out what exiled and deported means, and till now we don't know. And this is just, a small reporting of who are the groups. But what I would add is I was a bit heartbroken or maybe disappointed that none of these lists included, for example, the 300 plus children who are unlawfully held in Israeli detention, which was honestly a bit of a slap to the face. But I would focus on the broader around 2,000 Palestinians who were released. And none of these groups included specifically women. There were 2 women from Gaza released, but we still have 50 Palestinian women and a girl held in Israeli detention without an understanding about the conditions. We know about the conditions, but without knowing when they will ever be released.
That was Milena Ansari from Human Rights Watch speaking to me earlier today. We'll be releasing a slightly longer version of that interview tonight at 9 p.m, where we go on to discuss more about the conditions that Palestinian detainees are held in Israeli prisons. The Green Party is rising in the polls, and their membership has exploded. The Greens now have 100,000 members, up from 60,000 in March. The membership surge was, of course, driven by people joining the party to vote for Zach Polansky as party leader, and then people joining after he won that leadership election. And Polansky celebrated with a video to Twitter.
This is it. We have done it. I can announce we have just passed 100,000 members. That's over 30,000 new members since I became leader. This is a real moment, both for the Green Party and, more importantly, for our country. People need to know that there is a real opposition. We will challenge this failing Labour government, and we will take the fight to reform. So if you want a party that will tackle inequality, fund the National Health Service, put investment into our communities, and make the case for a positive, hopeful politics based in community and solidarity, now is the moment to join the Green Party.
Of course, for people wanting a vehicle to the left of Labour, the Greens are not the only option. Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn both spoke at the World Transformed Festival in Manchester over the weekend, where they tried to present an image of unity after initial splits in your party. And speaking to Turn Left Media, this is how Zara Sultana explained how the party, now known as your party, would be different from the Greens.
We had 800,000 people who registered an interest. Those 800,000 people haven't gone anywhere, and they are still watching us cautiously, and we have a job to rebuild trust and get them to join up as members of your party. We will work with the Greens where we have shared interests, and one of those is obviously defeating Nigel Farage and stopping him from becoming Prime Minister. But we have to be honest, there are differences between us and the Green Party. We are an explicitly socialist party. We should have a policy, and I hope members pass this, that we should withdraw from NATO because it is an imperialist war machine, whereas the Greens on their website say that NATO has an important role in maintaining security for its member states. If we look at NATO's track record, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, endless wars have made the world less safe. So we will have a NATO withdrawal position, an anti-NATO position. And also when it comes to Israel, there's no way that our party can support having diplomatic relations with a genocidal apartheid state. And so as I said in Paris at the weekend, every ambassador should be expelled, every embassy should be shut down, because there's no going back to a normal relationship with a genocidal apartheid state.
Helena, what do you think about this? I mean, you're a Green member, so I suppose you can't claim to be sort of like a neutral sort of figure here. I'm a member of neither, but I mean, also I don't claim to be neutral when it comes to this. I suppose I found the idea of like NATO membership being the sort of key dividing line a little bit like, how many people in the public care about NATO membership? And most people want to remain a member of it. So I feel like the idea that there's now this competition between these two left-wing parties who are encouraging each other to take positions which are essentially quite unpopular among the rest of the public seems like a slightly funny way to go about beating Nigel Farage. I don't know where you stand on this.
Never been a fan of NATO, just as most socialists. I've read all of the history, Operation Gladio, etc., etc. Not a NATO stan. But fundamentally, at a time of political crisis internally in this country, and geopolitical crisis, especially given Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is no real appetite in the public for re-examining a relationship with NATO. And given that most people's direct concerns in this country are about a cost of living crisis, whilst I don't think anybody who's on the left of politics, on the socialist end of politics, has any explicit support for NATO, I think there are a lot of people, and I am one of those included, who thinks that a re-examining of this relationship now as a forefront of a political prospectus for potential government is not one that is going to speak to the concerns of voters, other than to pique their concern over the security concerns that they have, that they believe NATO protects. Trying to have this conversation with members of the public who fundamentally see NATO as a force, as a bulwark against Russian aggression, when they're scared about what's going to happen with Russian aggression in Europe, despite the fact that many of us would make those claims or would find those claims unfounded, insofar as they would see the NATO aggression, NATO expansion has led to more destabilization than has it led to security, is not a conversation that's going to be easy to have or easy to explain. Whereas having a NATO position, which is, well, this is the consensus, we don't want to leave just yet, and if we do stay, and we should reform it to make it more pro-peace, for example, of course, very little example of being able to make NATO pro-peace in the long run anyway, but fundamentally, that's a way of being able to sidestep the NATO issue when most people are concerned about their bills. They're concerned about the cost of living. They're concerned about climate breakdown. These things are on the front of voters' concerns rather than our relationship with NATO. And so, given that Jeremy Corbyn ran on two political manifestos that both maintained things like NATO membership and a nuclear deterrent, for example, having those conversations now seems like something we should be doing later. Whilst I'm not going to be concerned with your party saying that they want to be explicitly anti-NATO, it's a position that I personally would share. I think that a pragmatic view that wants to ensure that we maximise the amount of people that can be brought into a potential electoral coalition for a left-wing party, makes more sense to be doing what Zach's saying, which is fundamentally that whilst we don't have any current plans to remove ourselves from NATO, in a time of geopolitical instability, which is being spearheaded not only from the East, but of course has been driven by the West for a very long time, and is currently being driven by a maniac president who says he wants to annex Greenland and potentially wanted to invade Panama. Having that person in control of our military operations and basically have control of access to the nuclear weapons that we have currently anyway, doesn't seem to be a way of ensuring long-term security when we could be forging actual defensive partnerships with European neighbors rather than being a yoke into American unipolar imperialism. But I don't think that's a conversation many people in the public want to be having. Treating it as a settled issue and focusing on the concerns of the people that we want to win over is much easier. And I think that we've seen the kind of simple messaging of lower bills, fund the NHS, nationalize the water companies is a much easier sell to disinterested members of the public than let's rethink our entire geopolitical situation, which of course we want to do here on the left. But fundamentally, to be able to do that, you need to have access to the levers of office, which will take a broad coalition. I think another issue which I think will mean that your party will have a smaller potential number of voters willing to come across or willing to be convinced of the party's prospectus for government is the European Union. Again, I'm not a fan of the European Union, and the failure of Brexit is actually a failure to take advantage of the benefits, such as access to more monetary sovereignty, control over things like how much deficit that we have, access to monetary financing of government deficits, and better trade policy, and indeed more access to things like nationalisation and less competition laws restricting the state's involvement in the economy. But of course, none of the neoliberal parties that were going to actually get access to government, a lot of the structures of the economy in terms of what the UK government is happy to do, were never going to make use of those things anyway. And again, in a time of geopolitical instability, at a time of international entropy in terms of what's happening, being part of a large political bloc, a large diplomatic and democratic political bloc, is going to be useful in defending us against the real enemy, which is international, supranational corporations that have more power than any single government is able to actually leverage, which I think is the biggest argument for joining the European Union, which is, again, a very large plurality position, not just amongst the kind of the broader kind of liberal left, but just amongst the general public and politically disinterested people who see Brexit as fundamentally a giant failure. And whilst I understand that I don't see your party having a specific position on this, although you'd think they would be most likely anti-EU like most socialists would be, as it's fundamentally a free trade bloc, I think the Green Party's position of wanting to forge better relationships at time of recording is more palatable to a wider electorate. That doesn't make it less explicitly socialist, almost certainly. And it's something that I have my concerns with in terms of the actual fundamentals of the policy. But again, like you can't really have everything that you want in terms of government. And when you look at the actual policy prospectus, right, like, are you willing to concede on these certain issues on the kind of the side of policy to broadly get an economic populist prospectus to government actually in office to be able to change the public's material conditions so you can then have those further conversations about things that are more structural and more kind of radical in terms of the way it changes the kind of historic nature of how this country has functioned outside of the economy, I think that would be much easier. It would be much easier to convince people of changing our relationship with international trade, of changing our relationship with NATO and geopolitics, once you've got into government off the back of solving the issues of the right here and right now that every working class country and this person can feel, which is that their bills are too high, their wages are too low, and they are alienated from production in every single possible way that Marx envisioned 200 years ago. I think this is the fundamental problem that is going to be found with the split between the two parties, is that whilst one is looking for purity, not necessarily purity, right, but is looking for something that is in its essence, that represents everything that socialism has to offer, there is a kind of more incrementalist approach from the Green Party that, again, I think has more electoral success potentially. But if you're trying to spread a socialist message, having a different angle from another political party, having a broad spectrum of tactics, both electoral and an organizational one that your party offers, where they are speaking to people within their communities and trying to change minds on the ground. Fundamentally, having that plurality of methods can only be a good thing as long as when it comes to the actual brass tacks of electoralism, they come to some form of agreement, which, fingers crossed, from what I've seen so far, from what Jeremy, Zach, Sarah and all the others have said, seems like it is on the cards. Everyone seems happy to work together, and that fundamentally is the key point that I like to see.
Yeah, although that's what because I thought sort of Zara was in another point suggesting that sort of NATO was a red line. Although maybe it's a red line for joining your party, and if you're not fussed about NATO, you can join the Greens, and then you can just be in an electoral alliance at the next general election. Who knows? Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.